The camera flash burned against her cheek. A manicured hand shoved her aside. "You don't belong in this picture." Someone sneered, their voice syrupy with disdain. Daniel, no more than 8, watched his mother's eyes fill with silent shame. She clutched the hem of her faded dress, willing herself not to cry. He felt something crack open in his chest, a raw, pulsing certainty. One day, none of them would ever look down on her again. Years later, when a gleaming supercar purred into the same driveway, no one recognized the man stepping out. But Daniel had never forgotten. Stay with this story, because some debts are repaid not in anger, but in triumph that leaves everyone speechless. The garden behind the grandfather's house looked almost too perfect. Boxwood hedges lined every path in tight rows. Marble benches shone so brightly they mirrored every movement. Not a single leaf was out of place. It was there under the hot noon sun that Daniel first learned what contempt looked like up close. He stood clutching his mother's hand. The rest of the family gathered for the annual portrait, arranging themselves with practiced ease. His mother had spent all morning pressing her one good dress, a simple navy cotton that still carried the faint ghosts of old stains. No detergent could ever lift them completely. Her hair, thin and dark, was pinned into a careful bun. She'd even dabbed on a little lipstick. It was the same tube she saved for weddings and funerals. She wanted so badly to look like she belonged. But nothing she did would ever be enough, not for them. Daniel's father had died 2 years earlier. Since then, his mother had struggled to keep them afloat. They lived in a small rented flat above the auto repair shop. Every day she worked until her hands cracked. His father's relatives were wealthy, polished, endlessly certain of their own importance. They only invited her now out of brittle obligation. As the photographer lifted his camera, Aunt Eloise stepped forward. Her voice was loud and bright enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry, but she really shouldn't be in the picture. It's not appropriate. Look at her. She doesn't match the family." The words struck like an open palm. Daniel felt his mother's hand shudder against his own. Her eyes darted from Eloise's lacquered fingernail to the polished shoes of every aunt and uncle. For a second she looked ready to argue. Her lips parted, then closed. She drew a long, shaky breath. Slowly she stepped off the platform. Nobody said a word. Not even the grandfather, who only sighed, tired and unwilling to interfere. The photographer waited for the moment to settle. Then he began clicking away as though nothing had happened. Daniel watched his mother stand apart. She turned her face slightly so no one would see the tears. In that instant, something in him hardened. A cold, silent promise bloomed in his chest. One day he would make them remember this moment. He would make them regret every slight. Later, as the adults drank tea and traded compliments, Daniel wandered to the edge of the garden. He stopped by the old stone wall that separated the manicured lawn from the alley beyond. Kneeling, he traced the pitted limestone with his finger. In his mind, he saw a wall so high none of them could climb it. Inside the house, laughter drifted through the windows. He heard Eloise again bragging about her son's grades, her husband's new promotion. They never once thought to check on the woman they'd sent to the shadows. He turned and saw his mother perched on a bench near the kitchen door. She was trying to smile, but her gaze kept sliding back to the bright, cruel scene in the garden. He walked over and slipped his small hand into hers. She startled. Then she squeezed his fingers as though she needed to be reminded she wasn't completely alone. In that moment, Daniel decided he would never let her feel like this again, even if it meant burning every bridge that tied them to this family. As the afternoon waned and the sun sank behind the tiled roof, the photographer packed up his equipment. Daniel watched the relatives gather for one last photo. This time, no one hesitated. No one questioned who deserved to be there. They looked satisfied, smug, as though everything had been arranged exactly the way it should be. His mother rose slowly, her back stiff. She walked toward the car without a word. Daniel followed her in silence. When he climbed into the back seat and felt the engine shudder to life, He let himself picture a different future, a future where they never again had to ask permission to belong. It was a fantasy that carried him through the years that followed. Years filled with second-hand clothes and whispered gossip in shop aisles, constant reminders that to them his mother was nothing but an embarrassing footnote. He memorized every slight, every sneer. He filed them away like weapons. One day he promised himself he would come back, not to ask forgiveness, not to be accepted, but to prove they had underestimated the wrong woman and her son. The years that followed blurred together, a parade of small humiliations and fierce private victories. Daniel grew tall and lean. He had the same dark hair as his mother, and a gaze that people learned to avoid when it turned sharp. He excelled in school, partly out of curiosity and partly out of spite. Every time he carried home a report card with perfect marks, he felt as though he was laying another brick in that imagined wall, one that would stand between his mother and those who thought she was nothing. Their apartment never changed much. The rent crept higher, the wallpaper peeled in the corners, but it was still home. On weekends, Daniel worked odd jobs, stocking shelves at the grocer, unloading delivery trucks. His mother cleaned houses. She always came back exhausted, her hands raw from harsh chemicals. Each evening she'd hum quietly to herself while she made supper, as if she were determined to hold on to some private scrap of happiness. Sometimes he wondered what she was thinking when she looked at him, whether she knew he was planning something bigger, something neither of them could yet imagine. When Daniel turned 16, he used his savings to buy a cheap used laptop. He taught himself about business, marketing, investing, the fundamentals of startup culture. While other kids played video games or went to parties, he studied late into the night, absorbing everything he could. There was a hunger in him that never seemed to be sated, a drive born from the memory of his mother's bowed head beside the garden wall. He hardly ever saw the relatives. They sent the occasional holiday card, thin, perfunctory notes with their signatures scribbled at the bottom. But no invitations came. Sometimes he caught glimpses of them in town, stepping out of luxury cars, shopping for designer clothes. They didn't recognize him at first, taller and older. But when they did, their polite nods felt like a fresh dismissal. The first time he tried to talk about his dreams, how he planned to build a business from the ground up. His mother pressed her hand to his cheek. She told him he didn't have to prove anything, but he only smiled and shook his head. For him, this wasn't about proving something to her. It was about proving everything to them. By 21, he had launched an online platform. It connected artisans with buyers across the country. He worked 16-hour days, pouring every ounce of himself into the venture. It started small, just a few listings and hopeful emails. Then the orders came, and kept coming. Within 2 years, his company had grown beyond anything he'd pictured, beyond that cracked wall garden, investors called. Journalists wrote profiles. His name started appearing in business magazines, alongside words like innovative and disruptor. Still, he lived modestly. He rented a simple loft, sent most of his earnings to a savings account in his mother's name. He drove the same old car. To the outside world, he looked like a quiet success story. Only he knew the success itself was just a means to an end. The day he signed the contract that would make him a multimillionaire, he drove straight to his mother's job. He found her in the back of a client's kitchen, on her knees, scrubbing the grout between tiles. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He had rehearsed the words so many times, how he would tell her they were free now, that she never had to bow her head to anyone again. But seeing her there, so small and tired, all he could do was kneel beside her and take her hand. When she finally understood what he was saying, she cried in his arms, her shoulders shaking. He realized that in all his imagining of this moment, he had never pictured her reaction, only the victory itself. But her tears were not of shame this time. They were relief, release, gratitude. The raw emotion made something in his own chest loosen, just a little. That night he signed the paperwork on a house, 3 stories tall, with a garden larger than the one behind his grandfather's mansion. He insisted his mother pick the curtains, the furniture, everything. She protested that it was too much, but he only laughed, saying it was just the beginning. Months passed. Daniel's reputation grew. He was invited to speak at conferences, to mentor young entrepreneurs. He rarely mentioned the past, but every time he looked at his mother, he remembered the promise he'd made as a boy, and he knew he wasn't finished yet. There was still a final piece of the plan, a moment he had imagined countless times, when he would confront every person who had ever made his mother feel small. He didn't want apologies. He wanted them to understand she had never needed their approval, and that he had never needed their acceptance. He began to make arrangements, quiet and deliberate. Invitations were sent out for a private celebration, a formal gathering to mark the company's expansion, and his own milestone. He asked the photographer to be ready. He rented a car, sleek black, unmistakably expensive. It would be waiting in the drive when the guests arrived. When his mother asked him why he looked so thoughtful as he checked the seating chart, he simply smiled and kissed her cheek. Because he whispered this time, "No one will tell you where you belong." The evening air was mild. It carried the sense of fresh-cut grass and lilacs drifting across the long circular drive. Daniel stood by the entrance in a tailored black suit. One hand rested on the polished hood of the supercar. Its gleaming curves reflected the string lights overhead, the glass doors behind him, the shadows of people already arriving. He had insisted the car be parked front and center, not tucked discreetly behind the house like some indulgence to be embarrassed by, but proudly displayed, a quiet monument to everything his mother had endured, and everything he had built. The first guests stepped out of their cars with hesitant curiosity. They were colleagues, local officials, and a handful of people who had watched Daniel's rise from afar. He welcomed each of them warmly, shaking hands, exchanging polite words. But beneath his calm, he felt a cold anticipation. It didn't take long for the others to arrive, the relatives who had long ago turned their backs on his mother. He recognized the nervous glances they traded when they stepped onto the driveway, when they saw the car. They must have known on some level that this was never just a business celebration. His Uncle Richard approached first. He was heavier than Daniel remembered, with thinning hair and a tan that looked too deliberate. He held out his hand, his smile practiced. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice oiled with false warmth. "It's been too long. Look at you so successful. Your father would be proud." Daniel accepted the handshake but didn't return the smile. "Would he?" he asked quietly. "I wonder." Richard's expression faltered, but he recovered quickly, glancing at the car. "Impressive machine you've got there." "It is." Daniel let his hand fall to his side. But that's not the point tonight. More relatives clustered behind Richard, their chatter subdued. He saw Aunt Marjorie, the one who had once told his mother she looked unpresentable for family photos. His cousin Vanessa, who had laughed behind her hand as his mother carried plates to the children's table. Faces he had not seen in years, yet whose scorn had never quite faded from memory. He turned, gesturing to the house. "Please come in. The reception is set up inside." They filed past him in uncomfortable silence, but not before each one cast a glance over their shoulder, at the car, at Daniel, at the knowledge that none of this belonged to them. Inside, soft music played from hidden speakers. The tables were dressed in white linens, tall arrangements of lilies and eucalyptus. Daniel's mother stood by the windows, wearing a deep blue dress he had chosen for her. She looked luminous, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes cautious but shining. When she saw him, she started to lift a hand, but then her gaze slid past his shoulder and faltered. "They're here," she murmured. "They are," Daniel said. He touched her arm. "But this time they don't get to decide anything." The evening unfolded with a practiced ease. Speeches were made, toasts offered. Daniel's employees spoke of his vision, his determination, his refusal to let setbacks stop him. Guests applauded politely, some sincerely, some out of obligation. But he saw how the relatives kept glancing at the car outside, at his mother standing confidently beside him. After dinner, he took the microphone. The applause died down. The hush was complete. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady. "Some of you have known me since I was a child. You knew my mother, too. You knew where we came from." He paused, scanning the crowd. No one dared look away. "For a long time, I thought success would make me forget the past, that if I built something big enough, if I achieved enough, I wouldn't care anymore." He swallowed, feeling the heat rising in his chest. But that's not true. His mother's eyes glistened. "I remember everything. I remember every look, every whisper, every time my mother was made to feel small because she didn't fit someone else's idea of what was acceptable." A ripple of discomfort moved through the relatives. A chair creaked as someone shifted. "But tonight is not about bitterness. It's about truth." Daniel lifted his chin. "The truth is you were wrong." He gestured to his mother. She stood frozen, tears on her cheeks. "She was never less. She was never undeserving. She was the strongest person I have ever known. And every success I've had is because she taught me not to believe your lies." The room held its breath. "So tonight we're going to take a picture," he continued, his voice calm. "A picture of my mother and everything she deserves." He motioned to the photographer waiting by the door. "Outside," he said, and his mother took his hand. Together they walked past the silent rows of tables, through the open doors, into the cool night air. The supercar waited, spotless under the lights. Daniel opened the passenger door, letting his mother sit gracefully on the leather seat. The photographer raised his camera. Inside, he knew the relatives were watching from the windows, watching as the picture they had once denied her was finally taken. When the camera clicked, he felt something inside him settle, as if a lifelong weight had finally been set down. This was not the end of his reckoning, but it was the first perfect stroke of it. As the camera flashed again, capturing his mother's soft smile framed by the sleek supercar, Daniel could almost hear the silence behind the glass walls of the house. The very people who once dictated who was worthy of inclusion in their family portrait now stood invisible, shut out from this moment of triumph. His mother reached out. She touched the polished dashboard gently, as if grounding herself in the reality of it all. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, this wasn't necessary. I never wanted revenge." But Daniel kept his gaze steady, the flicker of pain in his eyes masked by the night's shadows. "I know, Mom, but I did." They stood there for a few moments more, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The photographer respectfully lowered his camera and stepped back, giving them space. Inside, the relatives had retreated into uneasy clusters. Richard was nursing a glass of whiskey. His earlier charm dissolved into a tense scowl. Marjorie whispered harshly to Vanessa, their eyes darting to the door, as if debating whether to leave or stay. Daniel returned to the house with his mother at his side. The atmosphere had shifted. The energy that once belonged to the judgmental stares, the dismissive chuckles, was now his to command. He walked straight to the center of the room and addressed them again, his tone composed but edged with iron. "I know you all probably feel uncomfortable, that's fine. Tonight isn't about your comfort. For years you made sure my mother had none." Marjorie bristled. "Daniel, must we?" "Yes," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You must hear this." Richard tried to smooth things over. "We were young. We didn't understand. Let's not drag up old wounds." Daniel's laugh was low, humorless. "Old wounds. They're not old to the people who still feel them." The room was utterly still. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel continued. "None of you will ever again look down on her. None of you will speak of her as if she's less than any of you. If you can't manage that, don't come near us." The weight of his words hung heavy, leaving no room for protest. And then, as if the universe conspired to punctuate the moment, his assistant entered. He held out a folder. Daniel took it, flipped it open, and revealed the deed to the estate, now solely in his name. "I thought you'd all want to know," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "This house, the land, everything you thought would stay in your grasp, it's mine now. And hers." His mother looked at him in stunned silence, tears welling in her eyes. "I did it for you," Daniel said quietly. The relatives stood frozen, their illusions shattered. Later that night, as the guests slowly trickled out, Daniel and his mother stood on the balcony. They looked out over the quiet grounds. The supercar gleamed below, like a promise kept. Was it worth it, she asked gently. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. It's not about the car or the house. It's about knowing they can't erase you. They can't rewrite what you've meant to me. She rested her head on his shoulder. I never needed to be in their pictures, she whispered. I only needed to be in yours. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt peace. But deep inside, a part of him remained watchful, knowing the reckoning wasn't done yet. The scars ran deeper than one night could heal. In the days that followed, the fallout from that night rippled through every corner of the family. Whispered phone calls and tense visits ensued. Each relative scrambled to salvage their pride or reassert their version of the past. But the power dynamic had shifted, in a way none of them could deny. Daniel's mother, once overlooked and excluded, was now a woman they had to acknowledge, whether they liked it or not. The supercar parked prominently in the drive was a constant reminder, gleaming in the morning sun, as if daring them to pretend nothing had changed. When Vanessa arrived a week later, she carried a bouquet of lilies and an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel greeted her at the door, blocking her from stepping inside. I just came to make amends, she began carefully. Her eyes flicked to the camera crew. They were still documenting the renovation of the estate. He studied her with an unreadable expression. Make amends or save face. Her cheeks flushed. I didn't know it would come to this. I was young. We all were. You were old enough to know kindness, Daniel replied, his voice low but resolute. And you chose contempt. She looked past him, searching for his mother, but Daniel didn't move aside. If you really feel remorse, don't bring flowers. Bring honesty. Own what you did. Vanessa swallowed, her gaze dropping. I'm sorry, she said finally, the words small and brittle. I truly am. He nodded once, accepting the apology, but offering no absolution. She turned and walked back to her car, her shoulders hunched. Inside, his mother was watching from the window, her eyes thoughtful. You didn't have to be so hard, she murmured when Daniel returned to her side. I did, he said simply. Because for every year you spent thinking you were unworthy, they spent another reinforcing that belief. She reached for his hand, her touch soft and warm. And now Daniel said they understand that our worth never needed their permission. He led her outside, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the driveway. The photographer followed, capturing the quiet triumph in their faces. As they stood in front of the supercar again, Daniel gestured for his mother to sit in the driver's seat. She hesitated, smiling shyly. It's yours, he insisted. I want you to have this moment. She slipped into the leather seat, her hands trembling as they rested on the wheel. For a moment, she looked impossibly young, her eyes bright with wonder. This is too much, she whispered. No, Daniel said, crouching so they were eye to eye. It's exactly enough. The camera clicked once, capturing her alone in the car. No crowd, no sneering faces, no shadows of the past. Just her. When she stepped out again, tears streaked her cheeks, but her smile was steady. I don't care what they think anymore, she said. That's the point, Daniel told her softly. You never had to. As the sun dipped below the trees, painting the sky in ribbons of pink and gold, he closed the car door and turned back toward the house. He knew the relatives would talk. He knew some would never forgive him for refusing to pretend. But none of that mattered now. The story they'd tried to write about them, about poverty, about shame, about who belonged, was over. In its place stood a different story, one forged by defiance, by love, and the unshakable belief that no one had the right to decide another person's worth. Later, as the lights inside flickered on, Daniel paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. He thought of his father, of all the ways he'd failed his mother, and felt a surge of quiet promise. This was the last time she would ever be made to feel small. He took her hand and stepped inside, The past no longer owned them. Have you ever felt underestimated because of where you came from? Or seen someone you love treated as if they didn't matter? Stories like this remind us that dignity can't be given or taken by others. It's something we carry inside, no matter who doubts us. If you faced something similar, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. And if this story moved you, please consider liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Thanks for spending this time with me today. I'll see you in the next story.